Good morning, paisanos, and welcome all of you back to the Super Quickie, Super Chris, Super Chan, Super Reading, Super Show. So, a few days ago, ladies and gentlemen, we were talking about A-loggers and weens, and how there's very good reasons why you don't do it, outside of the fact that Chris won't listen to them. You kind of make yourself look a little bit like an easy target in return. Now, how much of a target is also very dependent on who is listening and who is reading the things you say. So just we don't do that sort of thing around here, which is ironic because in 2026, well, we'll get to that when we come to it. With that being said, however, enablers are, I would say, a little bit more serious. Well, in terms of the damage they actually cause. So let's get straight to it. Enablers, or devotees of Chris Chan Solitude, otherwise known as docs, as Chris has termed them, are those who encourage Chris's negative behavior and/or self-destructive habits. Enablers can be divided into two main classes. The first being financial enablers throwing money at Chris, and the second being the fantasy enablers endorsing Chris's grandiose delusions. They are not necessarily limited to doing these. The overall characteristic that defines all enablers is that they perform an action with the sole purpose of encouraging Chris to live like a child, whether it be encouraging him not to be employed, providing him with his most basic needs, role-playing with him, and much, much more. Some enablers, and white knights generally, fall into a subgroup referred to as anti-trolls, those who try to ward off other trolls and other members away with Chris to have for themselves. These are not to be confused with counter-trolls, who primarily fight against trolls to protect Chris rather to troll him themselves. For example, Helena Florenzia, a fantasy enabler who feeds into Chris's delusions, that Magi-chan is real. I mean, I know she doesn't do that thing anymore because she's kind of moved away from Chris, but to be fair, this had nothing to do with why Chris got into that much trouble, so Helena's not really that bad, but let's get into the actual definitions, shall we? Light enablers. Light enabling is the least harmful type of enabling that one can do to Chris. As some people who have talked to Chris have noted, one cannot communicate with Chris without entertaining his fantasies to some extent, and so rely on this technique, which involves merely acknowledging the beliefs without outright giving him any new lore or talking to him extensively about his beliefs. Gatekeepers. Gatekeeping refers to controlling access to Chris. It is used by trolls to prevent white knights and wannabe trolls from interfering, and by white knights to prevent trolls from contacting Chris. The Miscreants troll group, for example, actively interfered with White Knight attempts to help Chris by deleting their emails before Chris could read them, or by manipulating Chris to believing the White Knights were leaking information. The Watchmen, a White Knight/enabler group, tried to gatekeep Chris from trolls. In the case of Larry Vaughn, they pointed out Chris shouldn't interact with him, though Chris insisted. In the case of Jacob Sockness, however, they had Chris record Chris releases a statement regarding Jacob Sockness to discourage Sockness from completing his trip to see Chris. Fantasy enablers. Chris's grip on what is real and what is being fed to him was never that robust to begin with, and has eroded even further after years of being deliberately misled. It has wasted away to such an extent that he is nearly incapable of distinguishing seemingly even what ideas come from his head and what come from others. Enablers exploit this fact by presenting Chris with their own invented information about the dimensional merge or Chris's imaginary friends, validating his thoughts and convincing him that he is not alone. A prime example of this is Jacob Sockness, who used fictional dialogue between various characters between Chris's characters and his own imaginary pantheon. Chris fully believed that this dialogue was legitimate and expressed he had heard it himself. Collectively, these enabler fabrications are known as the cult of the idea guys. for they had their root in the Idea Guys' example and have become the basis of Chris's religious beliefs. This pseudo-cult's name is meant to poke fun at how Chris has incorporated all of his beliefs and turned it into a religion, where followers worship him as their god. And since the Idea Guys saga showed to everyone by mid-2018 that Chris really was this gullible, the go-to method for those trying to influence Chris has been to act as enablers of his delusions, replacing the previous method of posing as sweethearts. Financial enablers. Besides sanctioning his belief in his own divinity, there is one other way that enablers have found in winning Chris over, through his wallet. Though his situation is not nearly as dire as during the financial crisis some years ago, Chris remains as irresponsible with money and adamant not to work, as always. As a result, it is always precarious at best providing him with the money he regularly requests, whether through lavishing him with expensive gifts, buying his overpriced shoddy merchandise, or donating monthly for comics he does not want to make. Is a technique used by enablers who can afford it, as Sarah and Steve, and even some who cannot, as Ali Hirschberg, to prevent themselves to Chris as being kindly and selfless. Often in combination with worshipping and joining in his role-playing. Over the years, Chris has gotten thousands from his audience in the form of donations and considerations. He has received thousands more in sales through storefronts such as eBay and Etsy. As the notice on our homepage suggests, the Quickie strongly advises against giving Chris money. And from what we can see through this table right here, laptop computer, Owena, North Carolina, received, and Chris seemed to be okay with it. But then we get into like post to house fire, $500 from the Kiwi Farms after the house fire. The very first thing Chris did, by the way, was complain about this because that's just an immediate impulse. Then $150 from fans in September, a Kickstarter campaign which Chris just used to buy Legos more or less. $1,000 from D-Stex in September of 2015, donated during the climax of the review series of Sonichu to fund the production of new pages for the comic. Chris used it to buy a new bed, arguably one of his only sensible purchases in recent years, but then failed to keep his side of the deal for almost 2 years by failing to actually deliver 100 pages of Sonichu, since this, by all accounts, this was interpreted as a commission payment. $500 from Sonic Rainboom, a Kiwi Farms user, and Chris mostly used it to buy stuff at McDonald's. That's pretty much what he used this for. Hundreds, mostly from Weens, and the specific amount cannot be determined. However, this was during the financial crisis, in which, despite the fact that Chris was crying as though he was absolutely broke, decided that it would be a much better and more robust attitude to have by wasting it on pretty much exploitative editions of Lego sets, body pillows, food, well, fast food and stuff like that. So the original, it can't really be determined by what exactly he was received, but we know it's been up there because this of course was the start of the financial crisis. $2,650 from selling off the Relics of Fail. Now this actually is still going on to this day, but includes, but not limited to, the Megatron pistol for $50, the Sonic Totem for $1,500, the Pokewalker of Fail for $100, and She Came for Quick.jpg, $1,000 as part of a set. This is despite the fact that Chris cut up the actual image into little square pieces, but still a little bit of a sticky tape, and it does all the difference. Meanwhile, $4,816.43 from Patreon from December 2016 to August of 2021, and there was a tally for a very, very long time about how many days had gone by since Chris had actually last met his paid obligations, and taking what we possibly know as a whole, although we might have to discuss this at some other point, I would say maybe $1,000 is what is what probably Chris did, like in terms of actual delivering of his products. It's possible it's maybe even as low as $500. Meanwhile, $1,000 from selling binders of his old Pokemon and UFS cards from January to 2018 to 2019. Now, apparently 4 binders of cards were sold, and at least one was purchased by a seller hoping to resell the individual cards. Probably had the right idea, to be fair. Selling stained pages of Solachu issue 14 for $100, which is literally just selling trash. $1,300 from Jack Jankowski in April 2018. Now, what happened was that Jack, aka the captain, gave Chris $1,200. Although this might not actually be the captain, it might be someone else. $1,200 for a luxury trip to the 2018 BronyCon in the hopes that he would get to meet him there. Chris thanked him for the money in "I have been paid to go, we'll see if I can go, seriously to be determined." Jack also paid $100 for a video, which Chris decided to bookend with unrelated begging announcements. Why Jack didn't just straight up ask for his money back is a very, very good question. Although, why is this something that Weens never thought to do? Why not? Why Chris could have done saved a lot of trouble and opened a Cameo account in that respect. Meanwhile, $1,000 from Miss Cherry in July 2018. Tried the pay-to-play method to being Chris's ex-sweetheart that eventually failed. $1,000 to blow away on what was basically some sort of elaborate trolling scheme doesn't seem that great, in all honesty. Also, $391 from Ali Hirschberg in the summer of 2018. It's about 3 hours' wages for me. I don't mind spending that on some Christery. During the summer of 2018, an anonymous VRS Davison said in YouTube's comments section that she decided to spend $200 to buy an old blanket from Bob on eBay, because she somehow considered it to be a piece of Christery. It evidently was not enough to pay a ridiculous sum of money for one blanket, as when Bob put up more blankets up for sale, VRS Davison purchased another one for $100 plus $25 in shipping. In October 2019, Ali Hirschberg would reveal that she purchased them through a US proxy. In November 2019, she paid for a $41 set of Twilight Sparkle's Secret Shipfic folder cards and gave $50 for a Magi-chan medallion. Also, $500 from Jill Duncan in February of 2019. And a Jill Duncan pledged $500 per month to Chris's Patreon, asking to speak to Chris, then cancelled the pledge 10 days later. But because Chris's Patreon account is set up to upfront payment, Chris still got the initial $500 and used it to purchase a replacement Xbox. There is no indication Chris ever spoke to Jill, as she requested. $400 to Sarah and Steve, spring 2019. They bought Chris a Nintendo Switch worth $300 and gave him $100 on Patreon. Also claimed to have funded a room for him at BronyCon 2019, $600, but pulled this due to Chris not paying attention to them. Minus $2,000 from Joseph Draft, April 2019. According to the creator of Chris Chan, A Comprehensive History, Gino Samuel, who was approached by Draft before the now infamous trailer was relisted in order to get footage for a documentary, he had paid Chris and Bob an undisclosed amount, assuming that the Kickstarter was meant to cover the costs already made. The budgeted $2,000 as payment for the collaborators is the maximum amount Chris and Bob could have been given, from the information available. Sorry about the slight interruption, by the way. My throat was beginning to close up. Anyway, $200 from David906 of May 2019. Now, commissioned Chris via Twitter for a Solitude medallion, shelling out $200 in order to get Chris's attention. Medallions were 30 quid each when Chris sold them on eBay, became a Twitter white knight for Chris until Chris mass blocked several perceived trolls, including David. And we see evidence of David pleading for the chance to buy a medallion, and when he got the medallion, David gave a glowing review, and then, well, Chris blocked David anyway. Now, it's not necessarily known as to why Chris did this, because he was more than willing to pay a troll anyway for something that just he wanted from Chris, but yeah, that's kind of weird. That, like, to be fair now to this David fella, all he wanted was pretty much a medallion. I don't really feel like it feels very conflicting. Meanwhile, $600 from BronyCon donor, July 2019. After Chris repeatedly begged on Twitter for $600 to fund a hotel room after his previous plan fell through, crashing with Sarah and Steve, who had ghosted him earlier because Chris kept ignoring their messages, a fan donated to Chris. $190 from Luke in October of 2020. A fan from Pennsylvania named Luke paid Chris $190 to autograph a variety of items which he intended to resell for profit. Chris delivered the signed goods to Luke's house personally. And finally, unknown, mostly from Weens, August 2021 to March 2023. Various fans have been making donations to Chris while in jail. Chris claims that he used this money to pay back the remainder of the $750 he stole from Barbara when he was forced out of his house in July, as well as to buy numerous items from the jail's commissionary shop. These included clothing, toiletries, writing materials, radio batteries, 2 Turkish prayer mat rugs, and numerous soft drinks and food items. Chris estimated his jail expenses to be about $50 per week. In the jail call from November 1st, Chris makes reference to one practically generous donation he had recently received. Total from enablers have given Chris over $17,806.43. And this is probably the conservative estimate. That is, if we're not counting for the fact that $50 per week was between August and March. However, if it is included, that's still that is extraordinary. That's almost the equivalent of about 10 months' wages for somebody in the UK, or just on minimum wage. And seemingly Chris probably had to do very, very little work for it. And bear in mind, but with that being said, this was over a number of years, at least as far back as 2014 to 2023. So 9 years Chris received that off the back of doing very, very little work, it would seem. Honestly, if Chris had hit his targets, he could have been closer to maybe about 50,000. But then I don't think... We're not encouraging that, by the way. It's just, if Chris had actually given it some thought, is all I'm saying. Now, what are the necessary motives for enabling Chris? There are several motives people make for enabling Chris. These include the following, but are also not limited to profit off of the community surrounding Chris. Many of these enablers are opportunistic hacks who aim to use Chris's platform to launch their career. These people do not have the talent required to make anything worthwhile and bait Chris into talking about them to help launch their career. A recent enabler, Ben Saint, badly attempted to develop a saga of his own within Christory by copying what Alec Benson Leary had done, which was to promote his own media and make money off of the fools who would buy that stuff. To do this, he fed into Chris's delusions and added some of his own characters into the Solitude comics. Joining the creative community surrounding Chris. Pro tip: nobody is stopping you from making fan media. If you want to, then by all means do so, but just try to make sure Chris himself doesn't see it. Mind you, I have said this before. What happens if you just create media of your own and Chris suddenly takes a liking to it? Well, what do you do then? Observers of Chris often include people who enjoy drawing, animation, fanfic writing, cosplay, and the like as a hobby. While many will post their artwork at places strictly for discussing Chris, such as the Kiwi Farms or Reddit, to keep their distance from Chris, enablers approach Chris directly with their fan art on Twitter or Discord, with the intent of seeking his opinion. Despite knowing full well he has issues distinguishing reality from fantasy, and will interpret their artwork as it is happening literally, over time, these enablers built up a community for sharing their artwork, with the side effect of affirming Chris's fantasies. Attention whores. Some of these enablers, not all of them, desperately seek attention, and approval from Chris is something they crave for the most. They want attention, and they obviously don't get enough at home. So the Quickie is the next best alternative to get it. People such as MKR9V, Helena Florenza, Jacob Sockness, Sarah and Steve, and Richard Righteous come under this category. They often ardently defend Chris's beliefs about being an all-powerful goddess and getting into lengthy arguments with others over their actions. To make Chris produce content artificially. For most people, it would be utterly despicable to manipulate someone as mentally ill as Chris, let alone so that he can become a means for their enjoyment. For the enablers with more spiteful intents in mind, they would argue that the reason that they are further deluding Chris is because it would encourage him to produce more content. They would tell Chris all kinds of nonsensical stories just so that he can act like their own personal lolcow to laugh at, not with. I'm just supporting him/her/them. This argument is most common among the more white knight or social justice oriented crowd. Those who take this approach see Chris as a victim of the alt-right trolls, or whatever villain of the week has been created to oppress them. As such, to them, Chris is a beautiful, unique creature who is to be coddled and praised, regardless of the merit of that praise. Often this praise will be sycophantic in nature, with constant praise of Chris' artistic ability and creative genius. Another common narrative is that Chris is a grown adult who is perfectly capable of taking care of himself, easily separating the wheat from the chaff in regardless to orbiters. We'll let you decide how competent he is. Not very much, I would say. To protect him from other enablers. Some enablers have already realized that it is impossible to communicate to Chris unless they can entertain his beliefs. So they attempt to assist Chris by, at first, playing into his own fantasies and then subsequently attempting to dismantle those fantasies from the inside, or encourage less harmful ones. However, attempts at doing so have mostly failed. Arguments against enabling Chris. Whether you intend to help Chris, make him fall further into his delusions, or attempt to pull a liquid Chris on him by playing along with his delusions, there are a handful of reasons for why enabling Chris generally is not considered a good idea by most people. 1. Enabling Chris gives him a motive to never change. It goes without saying, but if one's beliefs are confirmed all of the time by the people that surround them, they have very little reason to change the way they are. This kind of helping Chris is what made him so egocentric and puerile in the first place, and that was when it was just his parents enabling him. Even if you do have good intentions and a genuine desire to help Chris, this way of helping is ironically one of the most harmful things you can do to him. By reinforcing his delusional state of a mentally ill person, you are doing nothing but unintentionally making their life worse. On one hand, fantasy enablers will play into Chris's delusion to relive his childhood. On the other hand, financial enablers will constantly donate him money out of guilt. The actions from both groups combined have made Chris deny any sort of adult responsibilities because it made him believe that he can sit on his ass all day daydreaming, as other people provide him basic needs for him. The impact of the idea, guys, has been catastrophic to both Chris's mental state and the Sonichu universe. In recent years, Chris's mental state has deteriorated from fantasy-prone escapism to complete detachment from reality. Chris has become so delusional that he believes he is married to several Sonic recolors and a Pokemon as a part of a polyamorous marriage, is a goddess with psychic powers, is worshipped by millions as their Lord and Savior, and is even the outright reincarnation of Jesus Christ. By indulging Chris, that is, encouraging a 43-year-old man to believe he is really a deity and anime character after he was tricked into thinking that, in the first place, you are only making things worse, and even helping to perpetuate the idea guise's machinations. When a person has deluded themselves into a belief that he is potentially harmful to themselves and others, the best thing to do is not to reinforce said delusion, but rather to get the person professional help. Telling him that others agree with his nonsense only causes him to become even further detached from the real world than he already is. Agreeing with Chris that he is the holy patroness of a computer from the 80s, and that cartoon characters will soon start showing up, is the real world has also proven a prerequisite to interacting with him for any extended period of time. Even if you do not intend to indulge in his fantasies, you cannot interact with him normally to undo any of the damage done by the enablers. The guard dogs, who originally intended to keep Chris from getting manipulated again, also needed to play along by alleging that Chris's amethyst ring was causing psychic chaos to gain their position over him. Most who are willing to play along with Chris in this way would justify their actions to third parties by professing they are doing this to help Chris in the end. Unfortunately, despite their efforts, Chris had refused to cooperate with them any further, and decided to go back to his fantasy world and continue falling for other enablers no matter what they said or did to him. Rarely does interacting with him yourself to him about your world clashing with his create the same effect as him getting angry over a minor character design alteration or getting irrationally mad at a non-existent enemy. In the past, some of the best Chris content has come from his own head and actions. Most of the time, he is not even bothered by it anymore, seeing it as another happenstance in the world he created himself. This proves that by enabling Chris, you are doing the exact opposite of what triggers the best Chris by giving him what he wants, or further confirming and lulling him into a sense of complacency where he is less likely to produce meaningful and or entertaining content. Chris will always try to get what he wants, whether or not it is good for him. To add salt to an open wound, Chris has previously stated that trolling efforts from people like the TT Squad do not faze him at all, purely because they agreed with his views and were polite to him. Therefore, it would be insane to even think that trolling Chris in this fashion would get a laugh out of anyone. Chris also no longer believes in basic scientific principles, especially in the biological department, and already believes himself, as presumably himself alone, to completely understand the difference between what is real and what is fictional. He believes that all diseases as a result of extreme stress, and that by being physically connected to a virus, he can completely obliterate whatever allies him. For example, when Chris got a cold in December of 2019, he believed that the primary reason for this was due to how he was triggered by the redesigns of the Sonichu characters by Project SNT. If Chris gets inflicted with a disease, he will tell himself that said illness simply arose from his emotions and disturbances from other dimensions, as opposed to acknowledging he's ill and taking steps to heal himself. To continuously try and enable him with these beliefs, Chris gets pulled at risk of suffering even worse ailments without the proper care or treatment. Thus, when you enable Chris's delusions, you are directly putting his life in danger. The knowledge gap between you and Chris. Since the very beginning, Chris has had difficulties in empathizing with other people, or seeing things through their point of view. This especially holds true today, where he has become absorbed within his fantasy land. Some fantasy enablers, particularly in the artist community, might believe that they are not doing any harm by drawing fan art or fan comics that Chris likes. However, these people are fully aware that what they draw is simply fiction. Chris is not. Chris doesn't care about your fan art the way you think he would. He now sees it as evidence he can use it to confirm his beliefs about the dimension, and he believes the artwork depicts of working on improving it in his real life. There is nothing inherently wrong with creating fan art of Solitude or Solitude characters. However, doing these things, such as creating a persona Twitter account, aggressively pushing your art onto Chris, and RPing as your character, does make it highly likely that Chris will use the art as an excuse to recede deeper into his fantasy world. Getting sucked into drama surrounding Chris. The time and energy spent on getting sucked into drama, just to see who can influence Chris the most, is one of the classic signs of enabling. Because of how trolling Chris is the one-way ticket to fame for some, and due to the amount of people going by the Idea Guys' techniques, there has been a constant power struggle between groups of enablers vying for Chris's attention. Enablers have been trying to ward off one another in order to reign supreme. An example is a group within Jacob Sockness and Sarah and Steve clashing against a group with MKR Night V and Awkward Diamond 8. Sockness, perceiving MKR Night V as a barrier to his schemes, embarked on a smear campaign maligning her to Chris and nearly succeeded. MKR Night V found herself in the precarious position of both doubling down on her allegiance to Chris's beliefs to keep her in his graces, whilst trying to convince him that the parts of his beliefs that Sockness planted into his mind were invalid, representing time and effort going into enabling. As you may have guessed by now, this is a very sad situation to find yourself in. You are fighting endlessly over the same weirdo who does not know or care that people are fighting over him, and you are putting yourself at the risk of becoming massive troll bait yourself by doing it. You won't be able to influence Chris forever. Chris's fantasy beliefs getting validated just leaves an opening for others to eventually use down the line to manipulate him. An example is how a wave of copycats sprang up in the wake of the ousting of the Idea Guys, with several successful adapting their techniques and tactics to circumvent the events and the effects of the guard dogs to protect Chris. A related example is MKR Night V, who took a page from the Idea Guys playbook, pretending to be a CPU goddess to align herself with Chris's beliefs. MKR Night V claimed the charade was for helping Chris. However, by feeding into his delusions, she made it easier for others like Jacob Sockness to tap into Chris's beliefs to manipulate him in another direction. You will always be assumed to be acting in bad faith regardless of your motives. Due to how many White Knights and Weens have been using the same technique of playing along with Chris's fantasies, it has become much more difficult for Chris to determine if someone's been messing with him, or if they're genuinely trying to help him. Due to his continued facade of kindness towards people, he will of course always go for believing them first until they betray him. Therefore, enablers are always placed on the same level of people like A-Logs and Weens by Christorians, and are readily assumed to be acting in bad faith, no matter what they intend to do with Chris. The confidence built by playing make-believe of Chris has been abused several times, and made people complete laughingstocks on the internet as a result. Sarah and Steve, multidimensional White Knights, and Jacob Sockness would all get their foot in the door by affirming Chris's beliefs, in some instances pretending to channel fictional characters from other dimensions, and then betray their trust for their own entertainment, whilst onlookers from Kiwi Farms and the Quickie itself have watched White Knights reveal themselves in fact to be Weens many times before. The Quick community at large treats Weens without mercy. Even if you are not like the many traitors in recent history, It is impossible to get through to Chris any longer without deceiving him, and such guile is not looked upon favourably. Others have poisoned the well before you. You will be assumed to be acting in bad faith if you try to influence Chris for any reason and treat it accordingly. If you fail hard enough, you will be laughed at by the internet. At one point or another, you will be caught in the act, and you are going to have to spill the beans on your elaborate trolling scheme, because you can even do so. Someone is likely going to stumble across some really embarrassing information about you when they are trying to track down your motives. Remember, if you enable Chris, you will be assumed to be acting in bad faith, so the last thing you would want to do is show off, especially when others tell you to stop. Most enablers do not appear to be aware of the dire consequences of sharing their brilliant plans on various sites that either target Chris or ones he regularly uses, and they thus become the site's laughingstock of the month, just by skipping this caveat in their plans. An infamous example of this is the failed trolling plan of Sarah and Steve. Sarah first got the attention of Chris by asking for a Rose Tune medallion. When Chris had undoubtedly agreed to after they bribed him with a Nintendo Switch, Sarah then told Chris that she and Steve would move over to Virginia to be his only friends to help him out by giving him endless gifts and playing pretend with him as a means of further deluding Chris. This has brought them negative attention from trolls, even more so when they made a rise up when they tried to get themselves noticed by other prominent enablers to be declared King of the Weens. A more infamous example would be Jacob Sockness, an amateur sorcerer from San Francisco who pretended to be sexually attracted to Chris. When he was discovered by the Kiwi Farms in 2018, he became one of the site's most popular topics of discussion due to his many absurd obsessions and mannerisms. He too had a lot in common with Chris, being autistic, receiving a monthly tugboat, and believing to possess magical powers. Miss Cherry had also proven himself to be a target of ridicule after he had posted an inactive thread about him on the Kiwi Farms, just so that he can leak his trolling plan and show off. The farms naturally did not approve of this, and were not reluctant to dox him. This was made worse when he decided to double down and continuously talk about how internet famous all of this would make him. So the next time you attempt to troll Chris through enabling, always remember that you are at a greater risk of being a target of ridicule yourself. If you are successful enough, it can come off as just plain depraved. One of the 5 groups represented in the Unholy Quintet, enablers can arguably be considered some of the worst in many cases. Just like with A-logging and carpetbagging, the biggest reason of all of why you should not enable Chris with his malicious intents is for the legal liability. For some enablers, enabling Chris is more than just a game to mess with his comics. It can get to the point where they realize they can use his gullibility as a tool to do such malicious things to himself. Some can even tell him to go as far as telling him to commit abuse to both himself and to other people, as well as extort money from him. If this is to show you anything about enabling Chris with the intent of trolling him, it is that if you go that far enough with this practice, you will become the villain rather than the funniest guy in the chat room. Money given to Chris will not help sustain him for very long. After reading the above, you might realize that role-playing with Chris will not place you on the trolling honor roll anytime soon. Yet you might still wish to help him, and consider some kind of monetary contribution instead. This is also a bad idea. Up until August of 2021, Chris was adequately housed and fed, even if both leave much to be desired, and his monthly tugboat from the United States government provided him and his mother with necessary financial support that he, in fact, used to make more doing absolutely nothing than the average household worldwide gets for an entire family's labour. He certainly was not destitute. Chris's relationship with money is unhealthy. While he has not got himself into as much as a bind as Bob has, he lacks the forethought to save money for the future and attend to his financial affairs in a responsible way. He often spends his money on frivolities and then turns to his fan base to pay for necessary expenses that he could have covered himself, and he not squandered his money in any other way. While concerns for what he will become of Chris, or what will become of Chris after his mother passes away, are completely legitimate, Chris evidently shows no concern for planning for his future. When Bob is no longer with him, and more money that you give him is just to help him secure his future, will be frittered away on My Little Pony merchandise or Vidya. Giving him more money now just teaches him that he is free to live beyond his means without a shred of responsibility, because people like you will be happy to foot the bill. Your money will be wasted in Chris's hands and is best kept out of them. And finally, it's just not worth it. Seriously, don't even bother playing pretend with Chris at this point. At the end of the day, he's a seriously mentally ill individual in his 40s, and is in dire need of assistance from professionals. No matter what zany scheme you come up with an attempt to bring him back into the good old days, the fact of the matter is that attempting to feed Chris's delusions is a bad idea. Those days have long since passed as Chris progressively deteriorates. Playing into his psychosis to help him invent new ways to humiliate himself and become increasingly deluded about his place in the universe solely for your entertainment is not something that should be encouraged at this stage in his life. Likewise, it's repeatedly been established that the vast majority of attempts by trolls to try and to trick him, improve him in the long run, end up being futile at best and damaging at worst. At this point, it appears that Chris is the only person that can seriously work at fixing his life, and tragically enough, he seems to be more comfortable living in his own little world than rethinking his life to ensure a stable and better future. Now, you may be saying to yourself, after all of this, it does seem as though actually trying to say Chris that he's right, as opposed to telling him the truth, is probably more dangerous than we've at first made out. I will, however, add just one more thing to proceedings before we go. Even if you decided to ignore all of this information, and you wanted to go through with it anyway, I don't even think Chris, deep down inside, even thinks that this is in any way. This is a short-term fix, and when I say short-term, I do mean incredibly short-term. It's not long-term, and I think even deep down inside, whether or not Chris wants to admit it or not, Chris in some way must realize that actually we gotta think long term about things like this. I know there's gotta be something. I mean, Chris has been capable of understanding concepts like that before. Or maybe it's just because, well, so much has happened to Chris that it's nigh on impossible, because that means actually doing anything about it. Whilst at the same time, Chris has been given money before for doing nothing. And since Chris hasn't bothered looking for work in 16 years and is still relatively tolerant and comfortable living as he is, why start now? Quite a depressing way to end things, but yeah, I don't think there was any other nicer way to end it than that. So with all that being said, thank all of you guys for watching, and I'll see all of you guys again next time. Thank you.